Friends, welcome to this edition of Talking NW Synod, our occasional podcast. And today, my guest is the Reverend Tim Meadows, who is the Moderator of General Assembly and also a minister in the Mersey Synod. Tim, welcome. And you've been a minister all the way through your moderatorship. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think that's been a challenge. I mean, being a moderator for General Assembly in the United Reformed Church is quite a big ask for pastorates. It's been good for them. I think it's been good for me because in my particular case, I've been with St. Stephen's United Reformed Church and Allerton United Reformed Church in Liverpool for 10 years. So this year has been a year where we have been able to sort of stand apart and get some perspective, which I think is always healthy. And we've missed each other. But at the same time, as a minister, it worries me because there are things that are happening with the congregation where I probably normally would be very much involved. I've had to stand back. And that's been really tough. And I think that's been tough for the congregation too. It's not because I'm a great minister. It's just because when these sort of issues arise, when there's conflict or when there's death or when there's illness, people are used to seeing their minister.
Tim, when you were appointed as moderator, what were the gifts and graces that people said to you, yeah, this is what we see. This is why we'd like you to stand as moderator of General Assembly?
You know, I've asked myself that question. Being able to see the whole United Reformed Church and what it's doing in all its different places has been a hopeful experience. It hasn't been an experience where I'm walking away feeling like, what are we going to do now? I have huge hope for the church because I see what people are doing and how in local places, people are just getting on with the business of God's kingdom, God's realm. So in that regard, I'm very much encouraged and would trade nothing for having this year. It has been tremendous opportunity. When I was elected, Lawrence, I thought, what have I let myself in for now? I really didn't plan on getting this position, to be honest. I didn't think it was a easy shoe in the door. So I was really surprised when I was elected. But some of the things I heard was there was a sense of humility. There was there seemed to be quite a long experience, and there was this sense in which being an openly gay man in ministry and having lived through all these years, which I'm getting close to 40 years at this, it seemed it was time for the church to do this. And that was some of the things that I heard. I think also, in some ways, maybe I'm a fresh voice, but I also recognize that being a moderator at General Assembly, you have very little influence. And so maybe some of the things that I would like to see happen aren't going to happen. And I've had to wrestle with that. But I have lent my influence. And I think one of the things I said when I was being interviewed in front of the whole General Assembly was that I think stuck out for a lot of people was that people need to know our kind of being Christian. And we need to blow our trumpet much louder than we do. We kind of hide our gifts under a bushel. And I think people are very hungry to know about this kind of Christianity. People are yearning for grace. People are yearning for a Christianity that is more Jesus-shaped. Because we're getting bombarded with some frightening versions of Christianity, to be frank.
Oh, we
and
are.
our voice and our character and our way of being disciples is desperately needed, wanted, and I think is people are looking for it. But we're not good at being found.
No,
Uh,
no, we're not.
so,
No, I agree
so
with you.
so I think that was probably of the things that I said, Lawrence. I think that probably was the thing that moved the boat.
I think the form of faith that you talk about and our understanding of discipleship means that the church can be genuinely good news. You know, we're used these days to Jesus being good news and the church being pretty bad news. At least that's how the church is received. And I think that our strong commitments to justice and inclusion and discipleship, these are good things. And
Yeah.
yeah, I can see why why you were elected, and I'm going to put it out there. You know, had you been somebody who was seeking that office, I'd have been very worried.
No, I can guarantee you I was. And in fact, when I was elected, and I think you were there, I think.
I was.
Yeah, because I remember seeing you afterwards. I truly was a deer caught in the headlights because I really didn't plan for that to happen. So it was a surprise to me.
Well, I was personally delighted, and I've been proved right to be delighted. So bless you for the year that you've given us as a church. Tim, you're somebody who's very musical and for whom faith is often expressed in terms of music. And you've come to this podcast with 3 hymns that are significant for you, which is going to be a delight to listen to and hear your reflections. So tell us about your first hymn, and I'll play it.
Yeah, the first one is a hymn written by David. What's to David Hurd's tune "And You Are." And I have to say, with this hymn, this tune is the standard bearer for this hymn. Now, I know this hymn comes with some different tunes, but this is, in my opinion, the tune for this hymn, which was penned from the poetry of Richard Wilbur. What I love about this hymn, "A Stable Lamp is Lighted," is that this hymn takes us through the whole story of Jesus, and it says something to us about having to go through that whole journey with Jesus. Often when I'm leading Bible studies, I love to get people to take a piece of paper, and on that piece of paper, um, they fold it into 4 places, and they have a nativity symbol, and then there is the symbol of the cross, and then there's the symbol of resurrection, and then, of course, the symbol of Pentecost. And I love for people to, when approaching Christian life or even approaching Bible study, to somehow identify with the life of Jesus and to say, when was your crucifixion moment? When was your borning movement, your becoming moment? When was that time in which you felt you had a second chance, or you rose again, or it was a resurrection moment for you after a terrible incident or crisis? And then, of course, when have you found yourself completely supported and surrounded by community and welcome to the table of God's love and life? This hymn sort of holds that. But I think the thing to hear loud and clear with this hymn is there's a scriptural piece. One of it is from 2 Peter 1:19. We have the prophetic message more fully confirmed. You will do well to be attentive to this as to a lamp shining in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts. And then another piece of scripture carries on throughout the hymn, and it comes from I believe it comes from Luke, and this is when Jesus was approaching Jerusalem, Palm Sunday, which is perfect for this time of year. is Luke 19:40. The stones will cry out. I tell you, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. And we clearly hear those themes playing back and forth throughout this hymn. So I hope everybody enjoys it. I love this hymn.
A stable lamp is lighted. Powerful stuff, Tim.
Yeah.
Now that's not a hymn I'd heard before preparing for this podcast, and I was surprised that the title A stable lamp is lighted actually results in a hymn that's all about Palm Sunday and then about Good Friday. And you've described yourself as a Palm Sunday kind of guy. What do you mean by that?
I have found Palm Sunday to play over and over again throughout my vocational life as a minister, where we have these big plans, or I have these big plans, expectations of how things are going to turn out, or I have a vision of what I think I want to happen, or I have a sense of where my life is going, my 5-year plan, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And it seems that I have been surprised or have been turned just about every time. I know that sounds sad, but it isn't sad necessarily. It's just that um, I have not seen always where God is leading, and I also find that I find myself in that in between place, or that turning place in life, where what I thought was, or what I perceived, didn't turn out to be that way, um, and that God had something else in mind. Palm Sunday was the Sunday that I decided that I could no longer stay in the United Methodist Church many years ago, because as a gay man who is coming to terms with being a gay man, I knew I couldn't stay in the church.
Right.
So that drove me out of the church, and it crushed all those dreams of what I thought my life was going to be about.
Mm.
Through all of that, as I and I'm not the only one who experiences this sort of thing. And when I talk to other LGBTQ people, I think they go through this sort of thing as well. But yet there is this deep sense at which God is still walking with us. God is still at work. God is still has a purpose and a plan for us, even though everybody else doesn't see it. And I think when Jesus was going into Jerusalem, it was the same sort of thing. Everybody else had this huge plan for who Jesus was and what he was going to do and what he was going to be about, waving their palms and saying, basically starting a revolutionary movement. And Jesus's plan and what God had in store as the Christ was not for a moment in history, but it was for all time. And this failure to see the big picture.
Mm.
And so I learned this hymn, and this is not a hymn I've known all my life. None of these hymns today are, but they've come at key moments, and they usually have been at Palm Sunday moments, where there has been a fascinating transition into what I thought would be, but God had something else in store. And for me, it's been about trusting God, and I like this juxtaposition, particularly in this hymn, about the stones crying out and the stars bending their voices, where creation is speaking God's plan, where God is being revealed through the rest of creation when we get it all wrong. But when this hymn would come up, it just seemed to strike me.
Mm.
And so it has stayed with me. So that came from an Episcopal hymn book. And I think everybody should know that hymn. It's just gorgeous.
Well, I've enjoyed getting to know it, and the thing that struck me was the way in which I experienced it as a challenge to discipleship, or rather a challenge of what discipleship really means. It starts in the stable, and that's Christmas, and we all love Christmas because it's easy and it's happy, at least the way we do it is. And Palm Sunday similarly is We have a king who rides a donkey and his name is Jesus, and we wave our palms and all that sort of thing. And as you say, what we discover almost immediately afterwards, because Jesus in Luke's gospel then weeps over Jerusalem and says, "You got it wrong. You didn't recognize the day of your visitation." And it seems to me that what the hymn doesn't allow us to do is to miss all the steps along the road that lead to the cross, that it's inevitable that Jesus ends up crucified, not because God engineers it so that Jesus is there. I think we often blame God for Jesus's death, which lets us
Yeah.
off the hook. Whereas
Yeah.
actually, as you were saying, what Jesus is doing, Jesus ends up crucified because of the life that he lives, the values that he lives by, and the precise choices that he makes in society. And
Yeah.
that's what discipleship is. It's the lived stuff.
Yeah. And I think this the whole idea of where this, and I think this is at play in the world, actually, this atonement theology where God sort of planned all of this, and Jesus was um God caused this, and we blame God for all that happened. It doesn't quite compute very well that you have a father who does that. It's abusive, isn't it, to the extreme? And I
Yes.
think that, I love this term of, instead of atonement, same spelling, but with dashes, at one-ment.
Yes.
God is at one with us in that journey to the cross of sacrificial love. And what is love if it doesn't cost something? What is life if we don't have a purpose? What is life if we're not willing to give our life for something?
Yeah.
And Jesus demonstrates that throughout his whole life. And again, we're not alone in this. All creation is joining in this act of reconciliation.
Yes.
That God is up to.
Tim, your second hymn, How Shall I Sing That Majesty?
Yeah, I'll give you a little background. I know a lot of people know this one here in the UK. I had never heard it before until I came to England. And I heard it sung in local churches here. And I thought that I didn't, I actually didn't know much about it. But what I loved about this hymn was the way in which it talked about the grandeur and wonder of God. And it's also I would say, a very Calvinist hymn, in that it expresses the glory and grandeur of God and the sovereignty of God. And it is a reminder that we are creatures. And in some ways, this sort of plays in again, where we have to remember that that God is the one who is at work, and that God will carry out what God needs to carry out. God will be what God will be, regardless of what we think. And it's this sense of recognizing humbly our creatureliness. So I'll stop there, and we can talk more afterwards. But yeah, this great hymn, How Shall I Sing That Majesty, to the tune Cofen, is one that I learned in the United Reformed Church, and I learned here in England.
Right, let's play it. I see what you mean about God's sovereignty and our creatureliness. It's there.
It's very much there. Yes. And I didn't know much about the hymn. I just loved singing it, and I love hearing congregations sing it. And this one will probably wind up being at my funeral, I think. Um, it's about finally encountering, that the fullness of God. And I know it comes from quite an interesting place. I didn't realize that John Mason, who wrote the hymn, he was a millennial between the 17th and 18th century.
Oh, wow.
So if we want to think about millennials, this is a different sort of a missile who fully expected that Christ's second coming would happen then. And it makes me laugh reading the story of his poetry and hymns, because as a dissenting Anglican priest, he must have been involved or somehow was very close to the great ejection of 1662. And being a Calvinist priest, was felt that he was in the place of being a prophet. He was in the place of was all of a sudden found himself on the fringe, in a sort of way. And so he had this sense in which the second coming of Christ would be in this little English village called, and I don't know where it is, Water Stratford. And of course, I can just imagine some of his pilgrims gathering there, waiting for Christ to return, as we often see this happening with the change of centuries. So we're not alone when we talk about millennials between the 20th and 21st centuries thinking, the computer system's going to fall apart. Nostradamus has predicted this and that. So I think it's a normal thing for the change and millennials, and the sense in which, again, God is up to something, even though we don't know. Um, and I think with the Calvinist bent, that sovereignty of God is all the way through this hymn.
Yeah.
And so I didn't recognize who he was and didn't know about him until I started looking at the history of this hymn. So, yeah, it raises some issues actually about hierarchy and class and all those sort of things. But I think there's something to this hymn that I really love, in the sense of, maybe when it's all done and over, Lawrence, and in that good old folk gospel Christianity of my childhood, the sense in which at the end we meet that great sovereignty, we return to our source.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so in that way, I find the hymn beautifully written, and I love the music. Again, I love to hear it.
Tim, I wonder how you deal with, as it were, the dark side of God's sovereignty and our creatureliness. And by that I mean the way that, for example, I inherited my faith as a Presbyterian was that God is sovereign, and the picture of God that I somehow inherited, because nobody ever said it explicitly, it was just something I absorbed, was that God is this great cosmic-sized ego, and a very fragile ego in the sky, a bit like Donald Trump writ large, who needs constant adoration and adulation and groveling, and that humans as creatures are worthless worms who are so small and insignificant and deserve nothing from God and almost can expect nothing from God. Now that's an absolute distortion. But I think that that's alive and well in a lot of our spirituality, and I wonder how you respond to that.
Yeah, Lawrence, I think you are spot on with this. I think there is a dark side, and Calvinism of this sort is on the rise. And I see it popping up all over the place, and it's frightening. And such a hymn as this, I don't think that was the intention. I don't think John Mason would be up for this at all, even as a dissenter, who I think at some level, um, in his own time, felt that this whole idea of class and aristocracy and clergy and so on and so forth has been a distortion. I think he would agree with that. However, um, we see it being replayed. We see it when I look at my home country. I'm shocked and I am stunned by the rise of Christian nationalism and how easy that has been accepted. And so, this rise of Calvinism of this sort, which favors and privileges, I should say, those who are heterosexual, those who are white, those who are middle class and above, as being in the will of God. There is this sense of electness. I find terrifying, and I've seen it on the rise throughout the West, not just the U.S. I mean, Donald Trump is probably the loudest. Probably will always be the loudest. Um, yeah, person who will dominate the media with his crazy philosophy, but the strange adherence to this type of Christianity is very scary. And I I have to say I see it here too. I've seen it in some of the strangest places. And I'm struck by this sense in which people consider God's favor to be upon certain type of folk, which I think is terrifying.
Yes.
And I think it is perhaps, Jimmy Carter some years ago, where I did my theological study was at Emory University, and he came in and taught a couple of our ethics courses.
Oh, wow.
I have a great love for Jimmy Carter, even though he was probably a terrible president. But as a former president, he was great. He did a lot. And he used to say to us that the biggest threat that he could see for the 21st century was religious extremism.
Mm.
And my goodness, hasn't that prophecy bore out in what we see today? So I think, yes, there is a dark side to this. And I think there's also another dark side to this. And like you, I think I absorbed it because my father was Reformed Presbyterian. My mother, she was Church of Brethren, but she had a lot of that Reformed theology in her. And I can remember on a number of occasions where my parents would say, "Don't worry, God is in control." And in the sense in which, in other words, it's an excuse not to worry about the troubles of the world, such as the environment and so on and so forth,
Oh,
because
yeah.
God's going to see all this out. And in that theology, it's terribly dangerous and excuses us from responsibility. And the other thing, I think, growing up in that, I think, particularly in my teen years, I had a terrible fear of God.
Yes.
Um, and I think some of the decisions I made early in life, I thought God would fix if I would repent, God would fix those things. And that's not necessarily how it works.
The kind of resolution I found for myself about sovereignty and creatureliness, to where it has real power, discipleship kind of power, is when we realize that all of God's majesty and power and sovereignty in Jesus is deployed on our behalf as creatures, so that we're infinitely loved by God as God's creatures. And that's grace. And grace always goes to where we most need it. In other words, grace means that we don't get what we deserve from God as God's creatures, but we get what we need from God as God's creatures. And it's that where that ties in with the priority of the least first.
And I think that fits into another thing that's happened recently in the public square is when Vice President J.D. Vance, I think he came here or he came to Europe, and he was talking about the Ordo Amoris, which is the Order of Loves. And again, it was a very twisted Christian interpretation. Well, it wasn't a Christian interpretation. It was a twisted interpretation.
Yeah.
And when he said that, well, your love of family comes first and so on, but our love of the stranger, our love of the foreigner comes toward the bottom. Our love of the poor comes toward the bottom. We have to look after ourselves first, as if love is somehow limited.
Yes.
And love is limitless. And I would say the same for grace. There is no end to God's love. There is no end to God's grace. So why would you apportion it or even teach that it is apportioned? When in fact, it's a natural given that we love those closest to us. But the challenge is for us to love those who we would consider furthest from us, who are in need, who are different from us, who are poor, who are asylum seekers, who are refugees. And I was so tickled, absolutely loved it when Pope Francis was awakened to what one of his parishioners was saying, J.D. Vance in this case.
Yes.
Slapped him on the hands and said, no, that is not the Ordo Amoris.
Yes.
And he clearly explained that our first order of love is to go where there's need.
Which leads us to your third one, in the midst of new dimension.
Yeah, this is an American one, and above the hymns, this is the one that's oldest in my personal list. Believe it or not.
Right.
I learned this hymn in the 1980s. It's from the Reverend Julian Rush, who was the first out gay minister in the United Methodist Church. He was taken off from the role of ministers because of his sexuality. And the church basically said, we don't have room for you. But miraculously, what happened in his story is that there was a tiny little United Methodist Church in Denver, Colorado, that had no money. And they said that they would accept him as their minister, but they couldn't pay him. So he was non-stipendiary. And they accepted him as their minister. And so this hymn was written at the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis when so many were dying, when the church had turned its back, when government was busy judging people, and in the States at least, was not going to give funding to research for HIV and AIDS. Julian Rush decided to pen this beautiful hymn, and indeed it's gorgeous. The lyrics, again, are weighty, but the tune is quite singable and it's catchy. So I hope you enjoy this in the midst of new dimensions. And this I dearly love this hymn. It's very prophetic in nature. So yeah, I offer that.
Well, let's listen. Wow. Powerful stuff.
Thing that's great about that one is it's very prophetic, it's aspirational. And I think that even in the midst of worries, of struggles, of frustrations, even in the things that we get wrong, um, God is still leading. We're still being called forward, um, and that God is walking with us. So it is. I think it's a very gracious hymn. In the midst of all that he was going through,
Yeah.
he wrote something so hopeful and so deeply trusting, um, of his faith, and I think it's great integrity. There's something about integrity there that even though people might be against you, even though people may disagree or don't understand or are afraid of what's being presented, we have our integrity, and if we live faithfully into that, um, the truth will bear itself out. So
Mm.
yeah, there's something profoundly hopeful about that hymn. I think it's a great Easter hymn as well.
It is. The thing that I first heard as I listened and then reflected was that it's got a real sting in the tail as well, a powerful sting in the tail that is a challenge to recognize where we're blinded. It's about inclusion.
Mm,
And the longer one sits with the words, the more one realizes we can't fool ourselves. You know, we're great as URC churches at slapping everybody welcome on our notice boards. And of course, we know that that's not actually true in many, many cases.
yeah.
And it's not because we don't want it to be true. We believe that we are being welcoming to everyone. It's just that as we listen to the stories of people, they tell us that they're not actually part of that welcome group. And I think you'd said earlier about the complex themes, but a very sort of easy tune. It flies under the radar and it smuggles that challenge to say, really? When we're talking about God's vision of everybody welcome, it is everybody welcome.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the same sort of thing happens with Stuart Townend's Vagabonds.
Yes.
That happens in this hymn. But I think you're exactly right because there is a painful piece in this hymn about rejection,
Hmm.
and about making sure we get everybody to the table. And it wasn't only for LGBTQ people, but it was mentioning people of different ethnic backgrounds, race, genders, the whole lot of God's humanity that God so loves, is to be included. I think often when you get someone who takes on a leadership role, um, who is either black or brown or who is gay or trans or whatever, that there is the expectation by some that it's going to be a one issue person, and I didn't want to do that. However, there are moments when I felt maybe I should have pushed a little bit harder on the church this year about that very question, where we have churches that put welcome. They say they're welcome. I've even had ministers say to me, the URC is an inclusive church. There's not an uninclusive church in the URC, which of course I laugh at. The tragedy is, and I think it does hurt our witness, that we do have people who buy the label, because the URC does, as far as family of churches in the UK, we do have. I think we are known for being liberal and open. I think largely people think that.
Yes.
The ones who pay attention to that anyway. And then they walk into some of these places and they're not. There's suspicion. They're treated awkwardly, or maybe not even spoken to. So I think um, there is an issue here, and I think there is an elephant in the room, Lawrence. And I, for one, and I know that in the URC, as small as we are, we can't afford any more division or any more struggle than we've got. But I think there is something about we need to be able to identify where those open and welcoming and affirming places are. Because I have always had a huge concern for those who would walk into a URC church,
Hmm.
and these folks, uh, they're they're not going to do that. And you're going to find yourself in a very unwelcoming, awkward place. And then, of course, well, why go? Why trust this institution? And we haven't dealt with that. We have not dealt with it. And I think it is one of the big elephants in the room.
Yes, you said you sometimes worry that you weren't as forthright about some of those situations as you might have been. But I suppose going back to the hymn in the midst of new dimension, if it does have a sting in the tail, you know, I imagine that your ministry will have a similar longer tail than perhaps than the 12 months, and that you've sown seeds during the year that have fruit to bear, yet to bear. And I
Yes.
trust that, and particularly that they only need to be mustard seed size for there to be a huge effect. And so I wanted to say, as much as I have any right to speak beyond myself, and certainly any right to speak on behalf of the church, but I did want to say thank you, Tim, for answering the call. Thank you for who you are and what you've embodied as a minister and as our moderator of General Assembly. And God bless you richly in what lies ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lawrence. And I hope you know the sentiments come right back at you. Um, I've admired you for so many years now, and you have been a beacon of hope. Um, I can remember from when I first came and I went to the Windermere Center and heard you speak and experienced the welcome there, experienced what your belief system was about. And I knew I had a friend. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim.